One shattered bottle turned a billionaire's dinner into a public execution, but the real villain was not the woman on her knees. 24 guests froze beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier. In the grand dining room of Richard Whitmore's mansion, the marble floor glittered with broken glass and spilled red wine. A rare bottle worth more than most people made in months lay destroyed at the feet of bankers, politicians, and society wives. And on the floor, kneeling quietly, was Grace Miller. She was 28. A housekeeper. 3 years in that mansion. Never late. Never careless. Never once complained. But Richard did not see 3 years of loyalty. He only saw a stain on his perfect evening. "You useless woman," he snapped, his voice slicing through the room. "Do you have any idea what that bottle cost?" Grace kept her head down. Her hands moved carefully through the broken glass. A small cut opened on her finger, but she did not stop. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. Richard had shoved his chair back too fast. His chair had hit her tray. The bottle had fallen because of him. But no one said a word. The guests looked away. One woman lowered her eyes to her plate. A man cleared his throat and pretended to sip his wine. Richard stood over Grace like a king judging a servant. "Clean it up," he said coldly. "Then get out of my sight." Grace slowly lifted her eyes. For 2 seconds she looked straight at him. Not with anger. With a calmness that should have terrified him. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. Behind her, the dinner continued. But something inside Grace had already ended. The kitchen door swung shut behind Grace Miller, and the roar of the dining room became a muffled hum. For the first time that night she could hear herself breathe. Slowly, carefully. Like someone holding a cracked glass in both hands. The kitchen was hot. Steam rose from silver pots. Plates waited under warming lamps. The smell of roasted beef butter and rosemary filled the air, rich and heavy, almost insulting after what had just happened. Martha Cole, the head cook, stood by the stove with a carving knife in her hand. She was 52, sharp-eyed and tough from years of surviving rich people's houses without ever letting them see her break. The moment she saw Grace, she knew. Not from the wine on her apron. Not from the tiny line of blood on her finger. From her face. Grace's face was too still. Martha lowered the knife. "Gracie." Grace did not answer right away. She walked to the sink, turned on the water, and placed her hands beneath it. Red wine swirled with water. Then came a thin thread of blood from the cut on her finger. She watched it disappear down the drain. Martha stepped closer. "Let me see." "It's nothing," Grace said. Her voice was steady. Too steady. From the dining room, laughter suddenly rose. Bright, polite, expensive. Richard Whitmore was talking again. As if nothing had happened. As if he had not just crushed a woman in front of 24 people. Grace pressed a clean towel around her finger and held it tight. Her shoulders stayed straight. Her eyes stayed dry. That was the part no one understood about her. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought obedience meant fear. They thought because she did not raise her voice, she did not have one. But Grace had spent 3 years in that mansion learning how to survive without giving Richard the pleasure of seeing her fall apart. 3 years of waking before sunrise. 3 years of ironing shirts so perfectly the collars looked carved. 3 years of remembering every tiny demand Richard forgot he had made. Coffee black on Monday. 1 sugar on Wednesday. No flowers in the study during tax season. Fresh towels folded a certain way because once he said hotel folds made him feel ordinary. She remembered everything. And he remembered nothing. Not her birthday. Not her last name half the time. Not the way she limped for a week after carrying laundry up 3 flights of stairs. Not the quiet way she kept his world running. Martha touched her shoulder. Just once. A small human gesture in a house where kindness had to hide. "You don't have to go back in there," Martha whispered. Grace looked toward the swinging door. On the other side, forks touched china. Glasses chimed. Men with power and women with pearls pretended they had not watched a grown man humiliate a young woman for an accident he caused himself. Grace swallowed. "Yes, I do." Martha shook her head. "Why?" Grace folded the towel tighter around her finger. "Because I won't let him decide what I look like when I leave that room." For a moment, Martha said nothing. Then Grace picked up a fresh tray. Her hands did not tremble. She checked each plate. Straightened the garnish. Wiped a tiny spot of sauce from the rim with the corner of a cloth. Even now. Even after everything. She did the job right. Then she pushed the kitchen door open and stepped back into the dining room. The laughter faded just a little. A few guests looked up. Richard did not. He was leaning back in his chair telling a story with one hand raised, already comfortable again inside his own cruelty. Grace moved around the table in silence. Plate after plate. Guest after guest. No rushed steps. No bowed shame. No tears. Only calm. A calm so complete it made the room uncomfortable. One senator's wife watched her with wet eyes but said nothing. The older gentleman at Richard's right cleared his throat and looked away. The retired actress stared down at her napkin as if it held some answer she was too afraid to speak. Grace served them all. And every person in that room felt it. The difference between money and dignity. The difference between power and class. Richard had the mansion, the chandelier, the wine, the guests. But Grace had something he could not buy. She had control of herself. When the final plate was placed, Grace stepped back. For one brief second her eyes met Richard's again. He barely noticed. But Martha, watching from the kitchen doorway, did. And she knew. Grace had not broken. She had decided. For 3 years Grace Miller had trained herself to become invisible. Not because she was weak. Because in Richard Whitmore's mansion invisible people survived. Before sunrise, while the city still slept under a thin gray sky, Grace was already awake in the small room above the service stairs. No alarm ever rang twice. Her feet touched the cold floor at 5:00 sharp. She made her bed with clean corners, tied her hair back, buttoned her blue and white uniform, and stepped into the hallway before the first bird outside the garden even made a sound. By 5:20 the coffee was grinding. By 5:35 Richard's shirts were lined up like soldiers. By 6:00 the silver was polished, the breakfast tray was ready, and the mansion began to breathe. Grace knew that house better than anyone who owned it. She knew which stair creaked near the library. She knew which window in the east hallway stuck after rain. She knew Richard hated too much lemon in his water but complained if there was none at all. She knew he wanted his study curtains half open, never fully open, because morning light made the room look cheap. She knew every rule. Even the ones he forgot he had made. And for 3 years she followed them. Perfectly. No late mornings. No broken dishes. No misplaced cufflinks. No forgotten guests. When Richard had business meetings she knew which bourbon went to which man. When his important friends came to dinner she remembered who avoided shrimp, who drank white wine, who pretended not to eat dessert but always finished it when no one was watching. She moved through that mansion like a quiet heartbeat. Always there. Always keeping everything alive. And still to Richard she was just the help. A pair of hands. A uniform. A name he only used when something went wrong. That night after the dinner plates were cleared and the dessert had been served, Grace stood in the hallway outside the dining room holding the empty tray against her waist. Inside Richard was laughing. Loudly. Comfortably. The same voice that had cut her open in front of 24 guests now floated through the room as if it had never carried cruelty at all. Grace looked down at her finger. The cut had stopped bleeding but the skin still burned. She pressed her thumb over it. Not because it hurt. Because she needed to feel something smaller than what was happening inside her chest. Martha passed behind her carrying a stack of plates. "You should sit down," she whispered. Grace shook her head. "I'm fine." But the words sounded different this time. Not false. Final. Martha stopped. She studied Grace's face the way only someone who had spent years beside her could. "You're not fine," Martha said softly. Grace did not answer. Because if she opened her mouth she might say the truth. That she could survive being tired. She could survive being ignored. She could survive the small room, the long hours, the aching feet, the orders barked without please or thank you. She had survived all of that. But tonight was different. Tonight Richard had not simply blamed her. He had enjoyed it. He had stood there in front of his guests and turned her pain into a performance. He had watched her kneel. He had watched her bleed. And he had gone right back to dinner. That was the part that finally broke something. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet crack deep inside. The kind no one hears until a person is already gone. Grace walked back into the kitchen and set the tray down. Her hands were calm. Too calm. She removed her apron, folded it once and placed it on the counter. Martha's eyes followed the movement. Grace. Grace looked toward the service stairs. Up there was her small room, her narrow bed. Her 2 brown suitcases. Her grandmother's photograph on the nightstand. The only pieces of her life that truly belonged to her. For 3 years she had told herself to be patient. 1 more month. 1 more paycheck. 1 more hard day. But patience had turned into silence. Silence had turned into swallowing. And swallowing had turned into a weight so heavy she could no longer carry it. From the dining room came another wave of laughter. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them they were clear. "I won't be here in the morning," she said. Martha's face changed. Not surprise. Grief. Because she understood. Grace was not making a threat. She was not asking to be stopped. She was already leaving. Martha stepped closer. "Where will you go?" Grace gave the smallest smile. The kind that barely reached her lips. "Somewhere I can remember who I am." The kitchen went quiet. Even the boiling pot seemed to soften. Grace untied the ribbon from her hair and held it in her palm. For 3 years, she had given that house her mornings, her strength, her patience, and her dignity. Tonight Richard Whitmore thought he had only broken a bottle. He had no idea he had broken the last thread holding Grace Miller to his world. And upstairs in a room no guest had ever seen 2 old suitcases were waiting. By midnight the mansion had gone quiet. The guests were gone. The music had stopped. The crystal glasses had been washed, dried, and returned to their cabinets like nothing ugly had ever touched them. But upstairs in the small room above the service stairs, Grace Miller stood in the silence with 2 brown suitcases open on her bed. The room was barely big enough for one person. A narrow bed. A thin closet. A small window facing the back garden. A nightstand with 3 books, a rosary, and an old photograph of her grandmother, Eleanor Grace. Grace picked up the photograph and held it for a long moment. Her grandmother's face looked back at her. Soft eyes. Tired hands. A woman who had known hard work but never let hard work steal her soul. Grace whispered, "I tried." The words barely made a sound. Then she set the photograph carefully inside one suitcase. She did not cry. That was the strange thing. After everything Richard had said, after the laughter behind the dining room door, after the guests watched her bleed on the marble and did nothing, no tears came. Only stillness. A deep final stillness. Grace opened the closet and began folding her clothes. 1 blouse. 1 sweater. 2 skirts. A pair of worn shoes. Everything she owned fit into 2 suitcases because Grace had learned a long time ago not to own more than she could carry alone. Outside the garden sprinklers clicked on. Water whispered across the lawn. Inside the mansion expensive clocks ticked from room to room counting down the last hours. Richard Whitmore would still have her in his house. Grace folded every item with the same care she had given his shirts for 3 years. No anger in her hands. No shaking. No throwing things into a bag. She was not escaping. She was leaving with dignity. When she reached for her blue and white uniform, she paused. That uniform had been the first thing Richard's house had given her. And the last thing it would ever take from her. She laid it flat on the bed, smoothed the collar, folded the sleeves inward, and placed it on top of everything else. Clean, pressed, perfect. A final answer without a raised voice. Then she sat at the tiny desk by the window and took out a plain sheet of paper. For a minute the pen rested in her hand. What could she write? That she was tired of being treated like furniture. That 3 years of loyalty had meant nothing. That the bottle had fallen because he pushed his chair back. That one public insult had finally revealed what she had been refusing to admit. No. Richard would twist all of that. He would call it emotion. He would call it weakness. He would say she was ungrateful. So Grace wrote only what had to be written. Her resignation. Effective immediately. No request for payment. No request for a recommendation. No complaint. No explanation. Her handwriting was small and neat, each word steady on the page. At the bottom she signed her full name, Grace Eleanor Miller. Then she stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace stared at the blank space beneath her signature. There was one thing left to say. Not because Richard deserved it. Because she did. She wrote one final line. You do not deserve to know why. The sentence sat there on the page like a locked door. Grace folded the letter once, then again. She placed it inside a plain white envelope and wrote his name on the front. Mr. Whitmore. No dear. No respectfully. No warmth he had never earned. At 6:40 the next morning Arthur Bell, the elderly house manager, found her standing beside the library desk. She wore a burgundy wool coat. Her 2 brown suitcases rested at her feet. The folded uniform lay across her left arm, clean and pressed as if she were handing back a piece of someone else's life. Arthur stopped in the doorway. Grace? She turned. Good morning, Mr. Bell. His eyes moved from the suitcases to the envelope on the desk. His face tightened. Wait, he said, softly. Talk to me first. Grace placed the uniform beside the envelope and smoothed it once with her palm. There's nothing left to say. He was angry last night, Arthur said. You know how he gets when important people are around. Grace looked at him. Not bitter. Not broken. Just finished. I know exactly how he gets. Arthur had served that house for decades. He had watched people come and go. Cooks, drivers, gardeners, maids who left crying, furious or afraid. But he had never seen anyone leave like this. Grace lifted one suitcase in each hand. Arthur took a step forward. Where will you go? Grace glanced toward the front doors. Then toward the staircase she had climbed thousands of times while no one noticed. For a few days she said, somewhere I can breathe. Arthur's eyes filled, but he said nothing. Because he understood. This was not a decision made in anger. This was a door closing after years of being left open too long. Grace walked through the grand entrance one last time. No applause. No goodbye from the man who owed her one. Just the soft sound of her shoes crossing polished marble. Then the front door opened. Morning light spilled in, and Grace Miller stepped out of Richard Whitmore's mansion without looking back. At 8:17 that morning, Richard Whitmore woke up exactly as he always did. No alarm, no hurry. No idea that the quietest person in his house had already walked out of it. He stood beneath the hot shower for 4 minutes, stepped onto the heated bathroom floor and reached for the robe placed perfectly on the brass hook. He dressed in the navy shirt Grace had ironed the day before, though the thought never crossed his mind. It was simply there. Like the coffee? Like the polished shoes. Like the sunlight slipping through curtains someone else had opened at precisely the right angle. Richard Whitmore lived inside a machine built by invisible hands. And he believed it ran because he was important. Downstairs, the dining room gleamed again. The table had been cleared. The marble floor showed no trace of last night's broken glass or spilled wine. The mansion looked untouched. That was what money did best. It erased evidence. Richard entered with his phone in one hand, already reading messages from business partners and lawyers. He sat at the head of the table without looking around. Coffee, he said. A moment later the tray arrived. But the hands holding it were not Grace's. Richard's eyes stayed on the phone. Where is the girl? Across the table, Arthur Bell set the cup down with unusual care. The old house manager's face looked drawn, as if he had slept poorly or not at all. Mr. Whitmore, Arthur said, Grace left this morning. Richard finally looked up. What? She resigned. The word hung in the air. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just clean and final. Arthur placed a plain white envelope beside the coffee cup. Richard stared at it, then gave a short, humorless breath through his nose. Resigned. He said it the way a man might say a servant had misplaced a napkin. Arthur did not answer. Richard picked up the envelope. His name was written on the front in Grace's careful handwriting. Mr. Whitmore. He opened it slowly, almost lazily, as if even the act of reading her last words was beneath him. The letter was brief. Formal. No bitterness. No pleading. No explanation. Grace Eleanor Miller was resigning from her position effective immediately. She waived any remaining pay. She did not request a recommendation. She thanked him for the employment. Richard's mouth tightened. Then, his eyes reached the final line. You do not deserve to know why. For 4 seconds he did not move. The coffee steamed beside his hand. The garden sprinklers clicked on outside, misting the perfect green lawn beyond the window. Richard read the line again. Then once more. Something about it irritated him more than tears would have. More than anger. More than a screaming accusation. Because Grace had not asked him for anything. Not forgiveness. Not money. Not understanding. She had simply removed herself from his world and locked the door behind her. Richard folded the letter. Call her, he said. Arthur remained still. She's gone, sir. I heard you. Call her anyway. She did not leave a number. Richard's jaw shifted. Where did she go? She didn't say. Richard leaned back in his chair. The same movement he had made the night before. The movement that had knocked the tray, the movement that had shattered the bottle. This time there was no bottle. Only silence. He tapped one finger against the table. Fine, he said. Call the agency. Tell them to send someone by the end of the week. Arthur looked at him. The old man's eyes carried something Richard did not like. Disappointment? Not fear. Not obedience. Disappointment? Sir Arthur said quietly. Grace was not easy to replace. Richard picked up his coffee. Everyone is replaceable. Arthur's face tightened, but he lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. Richard took a sip. The taste was wrong. Too bitter. He frowned into the cup as if the coffee itself had failed him. Who made this? I did, Arthur said. Richard set it down. Of course. The house was already proving his point. One employee leaves another, does the work badly, and life continues after a minor inconvenience. That was all this was. A staffing problem. A temporary disruption. Nothing more. He turned back to his phone and opened his calendar. 3 meetings. 2 calls. A banker at noon. A contractor at 4. His day was still full. His money was still there. His name still mattered. But the letter sat beside the coffee cup. White envelope, sharp fold, final line. You do not deserve to know why. Richard tried not to look at it. He failed. Across the room, Arthur lifted the tray and watched him quietly. The old house manager knew something Richard did not. The mansion had not lost a maid that morning. It had lost the woman who remembered how Richard's mother liked her tea. The woman who noticed when his pills ran low. The woman who stayed late without being asked. The woman who had kept whole parts of his life from falling apart while he never once looked down long enough to see her. Richard opened another email. Outside, the sprinklers swept across the lawn in perfect rhythm. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, the house felt slightly off balance. Richard did not understand why. Not yet. But he would. 3 hours after Grace Miller walked out of the mansion, Arthur Bell sat alone in the small office behind the kitchen. It was the room no guest ever saw. No chandelier. No marble. No velvet curtains. Just old filing cabinets, a wooden desk scarred by years of elbows, and a wall clock that ticked louder than it should have. Arthur opened the household accounts because he had to. Groceries, repairs, staff payments, medical bills for Richard's mother. Everything passed through his hands eventually. That was how the mansion stayed polished on the outside while chaos was hidden in folders and receipts. He adjusted his glasses and pulled up the salary records. Grace Eleanor Miller. The name sat there on the page like a small, quiet accusation. Arthur froze. One payment had failed. Then another. Then another. Then another. He leaned closer, thinking his tired eyes had mistaken the numbers. They had not. 4 months. Grace had not received her salary for 4 straight months. 16 weeks of work. 16 weeks of waking before sunrise. 16 weeks of cooking, cleaning, folding, serving, remembering, carrying, smiling when required, disappearing when ordered. And not once had she complained. Arthur's hand slowly moved to his mouth. No, he whispered. He checked again. Each Friday the automatic transfer had bounced back. Her bank account had been closed and Grace had never submitted a new one. She had never asked for cash. Never asked for an advance. Never even hinted something was wrong. Arthur sat back in his chair. The mansion seemed too quiet around him. From somewhere upstairs, Richard's voice drifted faintly through a closed door, speaking on a business call as if the world still belonged to him. Arthur stared at the screen. 4 months. A man like Richard Whitmore could lose that amount of money between 2 bank statements and never notice. But for Grace it was rent, food, bus fare, medicine, survival. Arthur stood too quickly and the chair scraped the floor. He knew Grace's room was empty. He had watched her leave. But something pulled him toward the service stairs anyway. The steps felt steeper than usual. He climbed slowly, one hand on the rail, until he reached the narrow hallway on the 3rd floor. The air up there was different. Warmer. Still. Forgotten. Grace's door was half open. Arthur pushed it gently. The room was spotless. Bed made. Closet empty. Floor swept. Window cracked slightly open. There was no smell of perfume. No clutter. No half-packed box. No sign that a woman had lived there for 3 years except the absence itself. That absence hurt more than a mess would have. Arthur stepped inside. On the nightstand, the dust had been wiped clean. On the wall, a faint square showed where her grandmother's photograph had hung near the bed. The mattress sat perfectly tucked under a thin blanket. Grace had left nothing unfinished. Of course she had not. Arthur turned to leave, then stopped. Something white peeked from beneath the mattress. At first he thought it was a handkerchief. He bent with a quiet groan, lifted the corner of the mattress and pulled it out. A folded bundle of papers. Receipts. Hospital receipts. Arthur's breath changed. He sat slowly on the edge of the bed and opened the first one. The header read, Oncology Services. His eyes moved down the page. Patient name Margaret Whitmore. Richard's mother. Arthur blinked. He opened another receipt. Then another. Special medication, lab testing, emergency treatment, private care adjustments. All paid in small amounts. All paid over the last 4 months. Arthur's fingers began to tremble. He knew Margaret Whitmore had been sick. Everyone in the house knew. Richard paid the main hospital bills through accountants and private arrangements. He paid the big numbers, the numbers people like him noticed because they appeared on formal statements. But these were different. These were the small gaps money did not automatically cover. The medicine requested after hours. The study the insurance refused. The extra care a tired nurse mentioned quietly to someone who was listening. Someone had listened. Grace had listened. Arthur stared at the receipts spread across the bed. The total was almost exactly 4 months of her salary. The room seemed to tilt. Grace had been working without pay. Not because she did not need the money. Because Richard's mother had needed help. The same Richard who had called her useless. The same Richard who had made her kneel in broken glass. The same Richard who had gone back to dinner while she bled. Arthur pressed the receipts against his chest for a moment as if they were too heavy for paper. Downstairs, Richard laughed at something on his call. Arthur closed his eyes. A sound escaped him. Not a sob. Something older. Something tired. He looked around the empty room again and finally understood what Grace's silence had been hiding. It was not weakness. It was sacrifice. And Richard Whitmore had no idea that the woman he dismissed as replaceable had been quietly helping keep his own mother alive. Arthur Bell did not take the receipts to Richard right away. He couldn't. Not yet. He sat on the edge of Grace Miller's narrow bed surrounded by papers that felt heavier than stone. The little room was so quiet he could hear the wind press against the small window. Outside, the Whitmore Gardens were perfect. Inside, the truth was ugly. Arthur spread the hospital receipts across the blanket one by one. Oncology services. Specialty medication. Additional testing. Private nursing support. Emergency treatment adjustment. Every receipt carried the same patient name. Margaret Whitmore. Richard's mother. The woman he visited only when his schedule allowed it. The woman whose illness he handled through accountants' assistants and polite phone calls from doctors. The woman whose main hospital bills were paid, yes, but whose smaller urgent needs had somehow slipped through the cracks. Except they had not slipped past Grace. Arthur picked up one receipt and read the date. 4 months ago. Then another. 3 months ago. Then another. 2 weeks ago. His throat tightened. Grace had known. Somehow, quietly, without making herself important, she had found out that Margaret needed medication the insurance did not cover. That one test had to be paid for before it could be scheduled. That a nurse had recommended extra care during the hardest nights. And Grace had paid. Not once. Again and again. With the salary Richard's house had failed to deposit. With the money she earned scrubbing his floors, polishing his silver, ironing his shirts, and serving his guests. Arthur looked toward the empty closet. There had been no new clothes hanging there. No perfume bottles. No jewelry. No small comforts. Now he knew why. Grace had given them away before they ever reached her hands. The old man stood slowly. His knees ached, but he barely felt them. He gathered the receipts and walked down the service stairs, one hand gripping the rail. Halfway down he stopped. From the main floor came Richard's voice. Sharp. Confident. Impatient. No, I don't care what the contractor wants. Tell him I want it finished by Friday. Arthur closed his eyes. That voice. The same voice from last night. You useless woman. The words came back so clearly that Arthur's hand curled into a fist around the receipts. He kept walking. At the bottom of the stairs, Martha Cole was standing beside the stove, stirring a pot she was not watching. When she saw Arthur's face, she turned off the burner. What did you find? Arthur did not answer. He placed the receipts on the steel prep table. Martha looked down. At first, she only saw paper. Then she saw the hospital name. Then Margaret Whitmore's name. Then the amounts. Her lips parted. No, she whispered. Arthur nodded once. 4 months. Martha reached for the edge of the table as if the floor had shifted beneath her. She paid for his mother. Arthur's eyes were wet now. She paid what no one else noticed needed paying. Martha's face hardened with grief. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The kitchen, always full of noise, seemed to fall silent out of respect for the woman who was no longer there. Then Martha whispered, and he called her useless. Arthur looked toward the hallway leading to Richard's study. The house suddenly felt different. Not grand. Not powerful. Small. Grill. Blind. In the study, Richard Whitmore stood by the window with his phone to his ear, staring out at the lawn. He was still wearing the navy shirt Grace had ironed. The cuffs were perfect. The collar sat flat. He had not noticed. On his desk, Grace's resignation letter lay beside his coffee. He had moved it twice already. But he had not thrown it away. That final line kept pulling at him like a splinter under the skin. You do not deserve to know why. He ended his call and turned when Arthur appeared in the doorway. What is it now? Arthur stepped inside. For the first time in many years he did not lower his eyes. Richard frowned. Arthur placed the receipts on the desk. Not gently. Not dramatically. Just firmly. Richard looked down. What are these? Hospital receipts, Arthur said. Richard glanced at the top sheet, impatient. I have accountants for that. These were not paid by your accountants. Richard's eyes lifted. Arthur's voice stayed quiet, but something in it made the room colder. They were paid by Grace. Richard stared at him. The name did not land at first. Arthur continued. Special medication. Additional tests. Extra care for your mother. The insurance did not cover them. The system did not flag them. Your people missed them. Richard's face tightened. That's impossible. Arthur pushed the receipts closer. She used her wages. Richard looked down again. His eyes moved across the numbers. One receipt. Another. Another. The dates stacked against him. 4 months. 4 full months. The room seemed to shrink. Richard picked up the top receipt, but his fingers did not hold steady. Arthur watched the first crack appear in the man who had spent his life believing money solved everything. She hadn't been paid in 4 months, Arthur said. Her deposits bounced because her bank account was closed. She never came to me. Never complained. Never asked for cash. Richard did not speak. She just kept working. The silence deepened. Outside the window, the sprinklers swept across the lawn in bright, perfect arcs. Inside, Richard Whitmore stood over a desk covered in proof. Proof that Grace Miller had been protecting his mother. Proof that he had not even noticed. Proof that the woman he had humiliated in front of guests had been carrying a burden no one in that mansion deserved from her. Arthur's voice dropped. "You asked where she went." Richard's eyes stayed on the receipts. Arthur looked at Grace's letter on the desk. "Now you know why she had to leave." Richard slowly sat down. The chair creaked beneath him. For once he had no order to give. No insult ready. No money large enough to erase what lay in front of him. Only Grace's final line. And now for the first time he began to understand it. Richard Whitmore did not cry at first. Men like him did not cry. They tightened their jaw. They looked away. They got angry at the person who brought the truth into the room. So for a few seconds, Richard simply stared at the receipts on his desk as if they were written in another language. Hospital charges. Medication names he could not pronounce. Dates. Amounts. And beneath each one, the same invisible signature. Grace Miller. The woman he had called useless. The woman he had ordered out of his sight. The woman he had watched kneel on his marble floor picking broken glass out of spilled wine while his guests sat frozen around the table. Richard picked up one receipt. Then another. His eyes moved faster now, searching for a mistake, a loophole, some tiny detail that would let him reject what was happening. There was none. Every paper told the same story. For 4 months while he had gone to meetings, dinners, charity events and private clubs, Grace had quietly paid for the treatments his mother needed. The treatments nobody told him about. Or worse, the treatments nobody thought important enough to bring to him. Richard stood abruptly. His chair scraped hard against the floor. "This doesn't make sense," he said. Arthur Bell remained near the doorway. "It makes perfect sense, sir." Richard turned on him. How would she even know? Arthur's face was tired but steady. Because she listened. That word hit harder than it should have. Listened. Richard looked toward the window. Outside, the lawn shone under the morning sun. Sprinklers moved back and forth in perfect rhythm. Everything he owned looked expensive and alive. Inside, he suddenly felt surrounded by dead things. His pride. His certainty. His version of himself. Richard walked to the side table and poured a glass of water. His hand shook enough that the water struck the rim and spilled onto the polished wood. He stared at the spill. A drop, a stain, a careless movement. Just like last night. His chair jerking back. The tray hitting Grace's hands. The bottle falling. And then his voice. Loud. Cruel. Public. "You useless woman." Richard shut his eyes. For the first time he saw it without defending himself. Grace on her knees. Her hair pulled back. Her uniform stained red, her finger bleeding. Her face calm because she refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking. He remembered the way she had looked at him for 2 seconds before walking away. He had thought it was disrespect. Now he understood. It was goodbye. Arthur stepped forward and placed one more paper on the desk. Richard opened his eyes. "What is that?" "A note from the hospital file," Arthur said. "One of the nurses wrote it after your mother's last treatment." Richard did not want to read it. But he reached for it anyway. The note was short. Payment received from Miss Grace Miller. Patient requested that Miss Miller be thanked personally for her kindness and discretion. Richard's breath caught. His mother knew. Margaret Whitmore had known. His own mother lying in a hospital bed had known that Grace was helping her. And Richard had not. He sat down slowly. Not like a man choosing to sit. Like a man whose legs had forgotten their job. Arthur watched him carefully. For years, Richard Whitmore had been untouchable inside this house. He gave orders. People moved. He asked for things. They appeared. He raised his voice. Everyone lowered theirs. But now for the first time there was nowhere for his power to go. No employee to blame. No money to throw at the problem. No speech to repair what he had done. Richard's eyes returned to the resignation letter beside the receipts. "You do not deserve to know why." He touched the paper with 2 fingers. The arrogance in that room began to collapse quietly. Not all at once. Just enough for the truth to enter. Grace had been there every morning before him. Grace had ironed the shirt on his back. Grace had remembered his mother's tea, her pills, her appointments, her small requests. Grace had paid bills no millionaire in the house had noticed. And he had stood above her in front of 24 guests and treated her like dirt beneath his shoe. Richard covered his mouth with his hand. Arthur looked away. Not because he wanted to spare Richard. Because grief, even when deserved, was still private. The first tear did not fall dramatically. It slipped down before Richard could stop it. He wiped it quickly, almost angrily. Then another came. His chest tightened. His breath broke once. A sound escaped him. Small. Humiliating. Human. Arthur had served the Whitmore family for decades. He had seen Richard furious, triumphant, impatient, drunk, charming, ruthless. He had never seen him like this. Richard bent over the receipts, both hands pressed flat on the desk. "She saved my mother," he whispered. Arthur said nothing. Richard looked up and his face had changed. Not enough to make him a good man. Not yet. But enough to show that something inside him had finally cracked. "She saved my mother," he said again, softer this time. And then the mansion, the money, the chandelier, the wine, the perfect lawn, all of it seemed to shrink around him. Because the woman he had humiliated had been carrying a kindness bigger than his entire world. And she had walked away before he ever learned how to say thank you. Richard Whitmore stayed bent over the desk, staring at the receipts as if the paper might change if he looked long enough. It did not. Grace Miller's name was still there. His mother's name was still there. And between them was a kindness Richard had been too blind to see. Arthur Bell stood in the doorway, his hands folded in front of him. For decades he had served that family. He had kept quiet when silence was expected. He had swallowed things that should have been said out loud. But not this time. Not after Grace. Richard wiped his face quickly, ashamed of the tears on his own skin. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped fully into the study and closed the door behind him. The sound was soft. But it changed the room. "Would you have listened?" Arthur asked. Richard lifted his eyes. "What?" Arthur did not repeat himself. He walked to the desk and stood across from Richard, not like a servant waiting for orders but like an old man who had finally run out of fear. "You asked why she didn't tell you," Arthur said. "I'm asking if you would have listened." Richard's mouth opened. No answer came. Arthur pointed gently to the receipts. "Grace did not leave because of one bottle of wine." Richard stiffened. Arthur continued. "She did not leave because you shouted one time." Outside the study, the mansion remained still. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm breaks. Arthur's voice stayed calm, but every word landed hard. "She left because for 3 years you made her invisible." Richard looked away. Arthur did not let him hide. "She woke before you every morning. She knew what you needed before you asked for it. She remembered your mother's medicine schedule better than you did. She noticed when Mrs. Whitmore stopped finishing her tea. She noticed when the nurses sounded worried. She noticed what your accountants missed." Richard's face tightened with shame, but Arthur went on. "Do you know why?" Richard said nothing. "Because Grace paid attention." The words seemed to echo inside the room. Arthur picked up Grace's resignation letter and held it in his aged hand. "You saw her every day, sir. Every day. But you never really looked at her." Richard's jaw worked, but no defense came. Arthur's eyes were wet now, though his voice did not break. "Last night was not the beginning. It was the last drop." Richard frowned slightly. Arthur placed the letter back on the desk. "A glass does not overflow because of one drop," he said. "It overflows because every drop before it was ignored." Richard looked at him. Slowly. Arthur held his gaze. "Every time you called her, the girl instead of her name. Every time you gave an order without looking at her. Every time you complained about something she had already fixed. Every time she worked late and you never noticed. Every time she carried the weight of this house while you acted like she was lucky to be allowed inside it." Richard swallowed hard. The room felt smaller now. The walls lined with books, the leather chairs, the expensive desk, the framed awards, all of it looked suddenly ridiculous. Arthur leaned forward slightly. "And then last night in front of your guests you made her kneel on the floor for something you caused." Richard closed his eyes. He saw it again. The chair jerking back. The tray tilting. The bottle falling. The explosion of glass. Grace on the marble. His own voice rising loud enough for everyone to hear. Arthur's voice softened, but that only made it worse. "You did not correct her, sir. You humiliated her." Richard opened his eyes. Arthur was no longer angry. That hurt more. He was grieving. "For 3 years, Grace protected this house from embarrassment," Arthur said. "Last night no one protected her." The sentence cut through Richard's chest. No one protected her. Not the guests. Not Martha. Not Arthur. Not him. Especially not him. Richard turned toward the window. The garden outside was perfect. Trimmed hedges, bright flowers. Sprinklers shining in the sun. A world maintained by people he had treated as background noise. He remembered Grace's calm face. Her steady hands. Her 2-second stare. Not rage. Not pleading. "A goodbye?" Richard's voice came out low. "I didn't know." Arthur nodded slowly. "No, sir." "You didn't?" Then he added quieter. "But not knowing is not the same as being innocent." Richard flinched. For once, no one in the room apologized for hurting his feelings. Arthur stepped back. "I served your father before I served you," he said. "He was not an easy man. But he knew the names of the people who kept his house standing. Richard lowered his head. Arthur looked at the receipts again. Grace gave your mother care when no one else noticed she needed it. And when she finally left, she still left the uniform clean and pressed. His voice trembled now. That is who she is. Richard covered his eyes with one hand. Arthur turned toward the door then stopped. Sir. Richard looked up. Arthur's face was pale but firm. You can replace a housekeeper. A long pause. You cannot replace the person you fail to value. Then Arthur opened the study door and left. Richard remained alone. The mansion was silent around him. On the desk lay the receipts. The letter. The final line. You do not deserve to know why. And now he knew. He knew enough to understand that knowing came too late. Richard Whitmore did not wait for the agency anymore. For the first time in his life, finding a servant was not the problem. Finding Grace Miller was. He stood in the middle of his study with her resignation letter in one hand and the hospital receipts in the other. The room smelled of leather, coffee, and money. Everything around him looked powerful. Everything inside him felt hollow. Arthur Bell's words would not leave him. You cannot replace the person you failed to value. Richard reached for his phone and called every number he had. Old payroll contacts. The staffing office. The hospital. The driver who sometimes took Grace to appointments. Even the clinic where his mother had received treatment. No one gave him an answer. Or maybe they did not want to. By noon, Richard was no longer sitting behind his desk like a man waiting for the world to obey. He was in the back seat of his black sedan staring through tinted glass as the city changed outside the window. The mansions disappeared first. Then the private gates. Then the wide streets with trimmed trees and quiet sidewalks. The car moved into neighborhoods Richard had passed 100 times but never truly seen. Storefronts with faded signs. Apartment buildings with laundry hanging from balconies. Sidewalk vendors selling fruit under umbrellas. Children in school uniforms walking home with backpacks nearly bigger than their shoulders. Richard watched them like he was seeing another country. But it was the same city. The same city where Grace had lived before she came to his house. The same city where she had worked, saved, sacrificed, and stayed silent. His driver Samuel glanced at him in the mirror. Where to now, sir? Richard looked down at the paper Arthur had given him. A name, a neighborhood, a possible address Grace had once used years ago. East Side, Richard said. Near Willow Street. Samuel hesitated. Richard noticed. What? Nothing, sir. Say it. Samuel kept his eyes on the road. That area's not like where you live. Richard almost answered sharply. Almost? Then he looked out the window again. A woman pushed a grocery cart with 2 children beside her. An old man sat outside a corner store folding a newspaper with careful hands. A bus hissed at the curb and people stepped off carrying work bags, lunchboxes, plastic sacks, tired faces. Not background. People. Richard leaned back and shame rose in him like heat. For years Grace had crossed these streets before entering his marble world. She had carried this life with her hidden under a clean uniform and quiet eyes. And he had never once asked where she went when the workday ended. Not once. They stopped outside a narrow apartment building with cracked steps and a front door painted dull green. Richard stepped out. The heat hit him first. Then the noise. Traffic. A dog barking. A baby crying somewhere upstairs. A radio playing an old love song through an open window. He adjusted his expensive jacket, suddenly aware of how wrong he looked there. A woman on the stoop watched him with guarded eyes. I'm looking for Grace Miller, he said. The woman looked him up and down. Who's asking? Richard opened his mouth. For a moment he wanted to say what he always said. His full name, his status, his importance. But the words felt disgusting now. So he said, someone who owes her an apology. The woman studied him, then she shook her head. She's not here. Do you know where she went? No. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you. He turned to leave but the woman spoke again. She helped my sister once. Richard stopped. The woman crossed her arms. Didn't have to. Didn't make a big thing out of it. Just showed up with groceries and medicine when my sister got sick. Richard's throat tightened. That sounds like her. The woman's eyes narrowed. You didn't know that, did you? Richard had no answer. She gave a small bitter laugh. People like Grace do a lot of good while people like you are busy not noticing. The words landed clean. Richard looked down. Yes, he said quietly, that's true. The woman seemed surprised by that. Then she looked away as if deciding whether he deserved anything more. She used to talk about her grandmother, she said. Said when things got too heavy, she went back to family. Where? The woman hesitated. Richard did not push. He simply stood there holding his shame in both hands. Finally she said, try the bus station. Folks leaving in a hurry usually go there first. Richard thanked her and returned to the car. But on the way back he did not look at his phone. He looked out the window. At the city. At the people. At the lives stacked in windows, buses, sidewalks, and small corner stores. All the lives his money had allowed him to ignore. At the bus station the air smelled of diesel coffee and old floors. People sat with bags between their feet. Mothers held sleeping children. Workers leaned against walls with closed eyes. Richard walked from counter to counter showing Grace's photograph from an old staff file on his phone. Most people shook their heads. Then an older ticket clerk paused. "She was here this morning," the clerk said. Richard stopped breathing. "With 2 brown suitcases?" "Yes." "Where did she go?" The clerk looked at him carefully. "Sir, people who leave like that usually don't want to be followed." Richard lowered the phone. For once he did not argue. "I know," he said. "But I need to return something she gave my family." The clerk studied him for a long second. Then pointed toward the departure board. "Small town route left at 910. Headed south." Richard looked at the empty gate. The bus was long gone. For the first time he understood what it felt like to arrive too late. He stood there as strangers moved around him, each carrying a life he knew nothing about. And in the middle of that crowded station Richard Whitmore finally looked small. Not because he had lost money. Not because he had lost status. Because he had lost the one thing Grace had given him for 3 years without ever asking anything back. A chance to be better. And now he had to chase that chance down a road he should have noticed long ago. The road south seemed endless. Richard Whitmore sat in the back of the sedan with Grace Miller's resignation letter folded in his hand. Outside the window, the city thinned into open highway. Tall buildings gave way to gas stations, small churches, faded billboards, and long stretches of land baking under the afternoon sun. For once Richard was not giving orders. He was following a trail. A trail made of things he should have known years ago. At the bus station the ticket clerk had given him only one clue: the route Grace took stopped in Maple Creek, a quiet town several hours away, the place where Grace had once listed an emergency contact. Her grandmother. Richard had never heard the name before. That fact sat in his chest like a stone. 3 years in his house and he did not know where Grace came from. He did not know who raised her. He did not know what she had wanted before life forced her into uniforms, service stares, and whispered kindness. The sedan pulled into Maple Creek just before sunset. It was the kind of town Richard would normally pass without noticing. A small main street, a pharmacy with sun-faded signs, a diner with red vinyl booths, a church bell tower rising behind old oak trees. People waved at each other from pickup trucks. A boy rode past on a bicycle with a grocery bag hanging from one handlebar. Samuel stopped near a small white house at the end of a narrow road. Paint chipped along the porch rail. Wind chimes moved softly above the door. Pots of basil and rosemary sat beside the steps. Richard stepped out. The air smelled like dust, warm grass, and something cooking nearby. On the porch, an elderly woman sat in a wooden chair with a blanket over her knees. Her hair was silver, braided neatly down one shoulder. Her eyes were sharp. She looked at Richard once and knew exactly what kind of man he was. "You're from the big house," she said. Richard stopped at the bottom step. "I'm looking for Grace." The woman's jaw tightened. "Then you're already too late for what you should have done." Richard lowered his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I know." The woman studied him for a long moment. That answer seemed to surprise her more than any excuse would have. "I'm Clara Miller," she said. "Grace is my granddaughter." Richard swallowed. "May I speak with her?" Clara looked toward the side yard. "She's not hiding. She's thinking." Richard followed her gaze. Beyond the house under a tree, Grace sat on an old bench with a notebook open on her lap. She was not in uniform anymore. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her 2 brown suitcases rested near the porch unopened. Richard took one step forward, then stopped. Because for the first time he saw her outside his world. Not serving. Not carrying. Not waiting for instructions. Just Grace. A person. Clara's voice softened behind him. "She used to study medicine, you know." Richard turned slowly. "What?" "My Grace," Clara said. "She was going to be a doctor." The words hit him harder than he expected. Clara looked past him toward her granddaughter. She had the mind for it. The heart too. Always did. When she was a girl she used to wrap my wrists when they ached and read old medical books like other children read fairy tales. Richard said nothing. Clara continued, her voice low and steady. She got into school. Worked nights. Studied on buses. She wanted to help people who couldn't afford to be seen by the kind of doctors rich people keep on speed dial. Richard's face tightened. What happened? Clara looked at him then. Life happened. The answer was simple. And cruel. Bills. Illness. Work. People needing her more than she needed her own dream. So she paused it. That's what she called it, A pause. Clara's eyes grew wet but her voice did not break. But a pause can become a grave if no one ever tells you to start again. Richard looked back at Grace. She was writing something in the notebook now. Her hand moved carefully across the page. The same careful hand that had written his resignation letter. The same hand that had paid his mother's medical receipts. The same hand he had watched bleed on his marble floor. "What is she writing?" he asked. Clara gave a small sad smile. "Old notes. Anatomy. Treatments. Things she never forgot." Richard felt something inside him fold. For 3 years he had believed Grace's life began and ended at his doorstep. But she had carried a whole future inside her. A future he never bothered to ask about. Grace looked up then. She saw him. Her face did not change. No shock. No fear. No welcome. Only stillness. Richard walked toward her slowly, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the tree, he stopped a few feet away. "Grace," he said. She closed the notebook. "Mr. Whitmore." The name sounded polite. And impossibly far away. Richard looked at the notebook in her lap. "I didn't know you studied medicine." Grace held his gaze. "You never asked." The sentence was quiet. It landed like a door closing. Richard nodded. "No," he said. "I didn't." For a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the leaves. Grace looked down at her hands. "I wanted to become a doctor," she said. "A long time ago." Richard's voice came out rough. "It doesn't sound like a long time ago." Grace's fingers tightened around the notebook. For the first time something moved across her face. Not anger. Pain. "Some dreams stay alive," she said. "Even when you're too tired to feed them." Richard looked at her and finally understood another piece of the woman he had failed to see. Grace had not only left a job. She had walked back toward herself. And he, with all his money, had arrived carrying nothing big enough to undo the years he had ignored. Richard Whitmore stood beneath the old maple tree facing the woman he had treated like she had no story. But Grace Miller did have a story. She had a dream, a gift, a future that life had buried but never killed. He looked at the notebook in her hands. Medical notes. Anatomy sketches. Care instructions written in neat lines. The same quiet precision she had used in his mansion had once belonged to something much bigger. "Grace," Richard said, his voice low, "I came to apologize." Grace did not move. The evening wind lifted a strand of her hair. Behind her, Clara Miller sat on the porch watching silently. Richard swallowed hard. "I was cruel. I was blind. And last night, I humiliated you for something I caused." Grace's eyes stayed on him. No anger. No tears. Just truth. "Yes," she said. "You did." The words were simple. They hurt more than shouting. Richard nodded. "I also know what you did for my mother." Grace looked away for the first time. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," he whispered. And that was the part that broke him again. She had helped his mother without wanting praise. Without asking permission. Without expecting anything from the man who had never once valued her. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Grace's face hardened. "If that's money?" "It's not a payment," he said quickly. "And it's not forgiveness I'm trying to buy." He held the envelope lower, almost ashamed of it. "It's a letter. From my mother's doctor. The hospital is starting a scholarship program for working adults who want to return to medical school. I made the donation anonymously. Your name is not attached unless you want it to be." Grace stared at him. Richard's voice trembled. "You owe me nothing. You never have. But if your dream is still alive, it deserves a door." Silence fell. For a moment Grace looked like the young woman she might have been before exhaustion taught her to hide hope. Clara's hand slowly covered her mouth. Grace took the envelope, but she did not thank him. Not yet. Instead she looked straight at Richard. "Changing one thing does not make you a good man." Richard lowered his head. "No," he said. "But maybe it can be the first honest thing I've done in years." Weeks passed. Richard returned to the mansion, but the house was different because he was different. He learned names. He listened before speaking. He visited his mother himself. He stopped walking through rooms as if people were furniture. And Grace? Grace opened her old books again, at first just 1 hour a night. Then 2. Then 3. One morning, under the same maple tree, she filled out her application. Her hands were steady. Not because life had become easy. Because she had finally stood up again. And somewhere far away in a mansion that no longer felt quite so grand, Richard Whitmore understood the truth. Grace had not only left his house, she had taken back her life. Never measure a person by their job, their clothes, or the place they stand in your life. Some of the quietest people around us are carrying the heaviest burdens. Some of the people we overlook may be the very ones holding our world together. Respect is not a gift for the powerful. It is a duty we owe to every human being. So tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone kind get treated unfairly only for the truth to come out later? And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about dignity, redemption, and the quiet strength that can change everything.